Hello guys, welcome to Hidden Timelines. Picture yourself standing in Alexandria, the crown jewel of the Ptolemaic kingdom in the year 89 BC. The city hums like a living organism, waves breaking against the pharaoh's lighthouse, camels groaning under the weight of ivory and spices, scholars in white linen robes hurrying between the great library and the Serapeum. But today the attention of the city is drawn inwards to the royal quarter, a labyrinth of marble colonnades and perfumed courtyards where Roman officials have come to pay homage to the most dangerous relic of the ancient world. You are led through corridors heavy with incense, past hieroglyph-carved walls and Hellenistic frescoes until you reach a chamber that seems to shimmer with its own unnatural light. Here stands the coffin of Alexander of Macedon, the man they call the Great. Only this coffin is no ordinary sarcophagus. At first it had been gold, but years of political necessity have stripped away its value. Now it is crystalline, translucent, almost glowing like a reliquary designed not to protect but to reveal. And what it reveals is enough to unnerve the conquerors of the world. Inside lies Alexander dead nearly 2.5 centuries, yet appearing almost as if in restless sleep. His skin has not collapsed into parchment. His features, still recognizable, seem suspended between life and legend. Roman witnesses, hard men accustomed to the sight of war wounds and charred corpses, draw in sharp breaths, for what they see challenges the very laws of decay they have always known. The body of the man who crossed Asia, who shattered Persia, who laid foundations for kingdoms that still fight over his memory, appears untouched by time. One official is said to murmur that the conqueror's face looked as though he might rise and speak commanding once more the legions of Macedon. Another crosses himself in fear, half believing the soul of Alexander lingers in the chamber, unwilling to depart. In the wavering lamplight, his closed eyelids seem almost ready to open. The atmosphere is thick with dread. They had come expecting a corpse. What they find is a mystery. But this is not merely an eerie curiosity. It is a political theatre of the highest order. For centuries, Alexander's tomb had been more than a resting place. It was a shrine, a pilgrimage site, and a lever of legitimacy. Ptolemaic pharaohs had built their dynasty's credibility by guarding his remains or by displaying him as proof that divine kingship resided in Alexandria, not in distant Macedon. Citizens and rulers alike would come to gaze upon his preserved form, offering tribute as though to a god. Even emperors like Augustus himself could not resist kneeling before the conqueror's glass coffin, daring to touch the cold brow of a man who had once ruled the earth. Take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these journeys into history. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it in your corner of the world? I'd love to know. In 89 BC, however, the circumstances are darker. Rome is extending its grip over the Mediterranean, and with it comes an interest in symbols of power. Roman generals and envoys walking into this chamber are not merely curious tourists. They are men testing the weight of inheritance. They are asking themselves what it means that this body, more intact than marble statues, rests in Egypt rather than Rome. The room itself reinforces the spectacle. Marble floors glisten with oil poured to trap dust. Bronze braziers burn sweet resin from Arabia, the smoke curling upward like whispered prayers. Priests in linen whisper incantations in both Greek and Egyptian merging traditions, as the Ptolemies had always done, while guards in polished bronze stand rigid at the door. Every detail is meant to project continuity, majesty, eternity. And yet behind the rehearsed grandeur, the chill lingers. Why does Alexander look alive? Why has time spared him when it claims emperors and beggars alike within hours? Ancient writers tell us the viewing was staged as reassurance. But for many who entered, it had the opposite effect. Instead of certainty, it raised questions. Could it be that Alexander had not truly died, when his physicians declared it so? Could his uncanny preservation be less a miracle of embalming than a sign of something more disturbing, something medical, something misunderstood? Here in this crystalline coffin, we are introduced not only to a relic but to a riddle. A riddle that haunted Ptolemaic Egypt, puzzled Roman conquerors, and still unsettles historians today. For if the greatest conqueror of antiquity did not die as the world believed, then his final days may conceal not triumph but terror. And as you linger in that chamber in Alexandria, surrounded by incense and whispers, the thought takes root. Perhaps the truest secret of Alexander the Great lies not in what he conquered in life, but in what he endured in death, or something perilously close to it. Babylon, June 323 BC. The city was swollen with heat, its air heavy with dust and incense, the Euphrates glinting red in the last light of day. Alexander had returned not as a mere general, but as master of half the known world. He was 32 years old, undefeated in battle, ruler of an empire that stretched from the shores of Greece to the mountains of India. His name already carried the aura of myth, Iskander to the Persians, Sikander to the Indians, a figure whispered about in marketplaces as both man and demigod. It was here in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar that he gathered his companions for a banquet. Feasts were not unusual. Alexander had long been famed for his capacity to drink, to sit with generals and soldiers alike, draining cup after cup in contests that left lesser men under the table. Wine was more than pleasure. It was ritual camaraderie, a show of endurance befitting a king who demanded as much of himself as of his armies. But on this night something broke. Witnesses would later describe how after drinking a bowl of particularly strong wine, Alexander doubled over with a cry that rang like a battlefield wound. He clutched his abdomen with such force that his knuckles whitened his body, bowing as if pierced by an unseen spear. Soldiers rushed forward thinking their invincible commander had been struck, but no assassin's blade had touched him. The enemy was within. What followed over the next hours confounded those closest to him. His fever rose in sudden waves, then fell only to return hotter still. He sweated through the linen sheets, his skin pale, yet burning to the touch. When attendants dabbed cool cloths upon his forehead, he waved them away impatiently, speaking with a clarity that unsettled his generals. He gave orders, dictated instructions, still the king in voice, while his body betrayed him limb by limb. For as the hours passed, his strength retreated from him in a terrifying progression. First his legs weakened, refusing to carry him with the vigour that had led charges across the Granicus and Issus. Then his arms, so often raised in command or in the swing of a sword, began to tremble and falter. Yet his eyes, those famously burning eyes that had stared down elephants and kings, remained alert, alive, commanding. The contrast was almost unbearable. Here was a man who had faced war elephants in the plains of India, who had climbed icy passes where even pack animals perished, who had stood wounded before his men to prove his resilience, now pinned to a bed by forces invisible. He could still speak, still reason, still map the world in his mind. But he could no longer command his own flesh. The physicians were summoned, the best in the empire, Greek-trained men, versed in the teachings of Hippocrates' Persian healers, who brought their own knowledge of herbs and poultices, even Babylonian specialists steeped in the omen-laden medicine of Mesopotamia. They pressed his skin, watched his pulse, inspected his eyes for signs of divine punishment or poisoning. They poured over him mixtures of wine and medicinal herbs, applied poultices, performed bloodletting in hopes of drawing out some imagined imbalance of humours. Each act was carried out with solemn ritual, for this was no ordinary patient, it was the living axis of the empire. Royal healing was as much theatre as science. To touch the king was to tread the edge of sacrilege, yet to fail him meant dishonour and ruin. Each physician bent low before Alexander, bowing to the body that had conquered the world even as it betrayed itself. They muttered incantations invoked. Asclepius consulted star charts to trace the alignment of the heavens. The Babylonian night sky was said to hold omens of fate, but no star could explain what they now witnessed, a mind unclouded while the body sank deeper into paralysis. His companions, the veterans who had marched with him since the days of Philip, stood at the edge of the chamber, their faces carved in fear. This was not the Alexander they knew, the man who once leapt into battle with reckless abandon, who wore scars like trophies, who laughed at wounds that would have felled lesser commanders. Here was a king undone by his own body, reduced to a helpless figure on a couch of Babylonian silk. And yet when he spoke, they still obeyed. He dictated orders for sacrifices issued, instructions for governance reminded them of campaigns yet to come. The image was jarring, a godlike conqueror whose flesh failed, but whose voice remained strong. It was as though some cruel balance of nature demanded that the man who never lost a battle should now fight one within himself, a battle invisible, insidious, and unwinnable by sword or spear. The banquet had begun with laughter, with the sound of lyres and the clink of cups. It ended with a silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. The world's greatest conqueror was stricken, his body slipping away piece by piece. The empire held its breath, for if Alexander could fall, then perhaps no man was invincible after all. The days that followed in Babylon were remembered by Alexander's companions as a slow-motion descent, a siege not of city walls but of the body of their king. Each morning they gathered at his bedside, expecting improvement, and each night they left more shaken. The symptoms advanced with the cruel regularity of an army on the march. The fever came first in erratic waves. Sometimes Alexander lay drenched in sweat, his hair plastered against his temples, the sheets beneath him soaked through. Then hours later his skin would feel as cool as stone, his breath calm, his eyes bright, giving his generals the false hope that the danger had passed. But by nightfall the fire would return hotter, crueler, accompanied by chills that racked his powerful frame. He who had ridden through desert suns and mountain frosts now shivered uncontrollably under Babylonian linen. Soon the weakness spread. His legs, already unsteady, gave way entirely. Attendants had to lift him from the couch when he wished to speak to his officers. Within days his arms followed, once capable of thrusting a spear through armour, now unable to lift a cup of water. Still his mind remained unbroken. When generals leaned close, Alexander spoke with precision, issuing orders for sacrifices, inquiring about garrison reports, even asking after the health of his soldiers. His voice, however, grew weaker with each passing day, until his words came out in hushed fragments, forcing listeners to bend low to catch them. The physicians, desperate and bewildered, tried every remedy their traditions offered. To the Greek trained among them, the fever suggested an imbalance of humours. The four fluids that Hippocratic medicine taught governed all life. If black bile, yellow, bile, blood and phlegm were in harmony, the body flourished. If one gained ascendancy, illness was the result. To draw down the excess, they turned to bloodletting, pricking the royal veins with bronze lancets, watching the dark liquid spill into bowls as though the empire itself were bleeding out through its master. The Persians, inheritors of their own medical wisdom, offered draughts of herbs and resins, sometimes seeking to cool the inner fire. They spoke of the pneuma, the breath of life, a subtle force coursing through body and soul. To them, Alexander's shallow, laboured breaths were a sign of pneuma trapped, stifled by invisible obstruction. They applied poultices of clay and aromatic oils to his chest and stomach, pressing them against skin already bruised by fever, praying the breath would find its balance again. Babylonian healers versed in omen and ritual stood apart, murmuring incantations to ward off malign spirits. To them, disease was not only physical but also a punishment or curse, perhaps the wrath of gods offended by hubris. For what man dared call himself son of Zeus and not draw divine retribution? They burned incense, traced sigils on clay tablets, placed charms beneath his couch. Through all of this, Alexander lay alert, eyes glinting in the half-light of the chamber. He endured bleeding, endured poultices, endured the endless procession of remedies, never railing against his doctors, only asking in his fading voice whether the sacrifices had been offered, whether his men still held discipline outside the palace gates. The conqueror of the world, immobile on his bed, retained the clarity of command. To the physicians, this was the most confounding detail of all. Fever usually clouded the mind, drove men into delirium. Poison gnawed at reason. Infection dulled the senses. Yet Alexander's thoughts were as sharp as ever. His eyes tracked each visitor, his memory held every detail. Even when his breathing grew shallow and words came only in whispers, the intellect behind them blazed with its old intensity. Each evening the chamber became a theatre of dread. The generals Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Seleucus, and the rest gathered in silence around the bed. They watched their commander's chest rise and fall, sometimes barely perceptible, as if the breath itself clung to him by stubborn will alone. They listened to his whispered instructions, uncertain whether to obey or to begin preparing for a world without him. The pulse, that fragile rhythm under the skin, became their guide. Physicians crowded at his wrist fingers, trembling, speaking in hushed tones of its strength, its pace, its skips and falters. In the Hippocratic tradition, to read the pulse was to glimpse the state of the inner cosmos. But here in this royal chamber, even the pulse gave no comfort. Sometimes it was steady, suggesting recovery. Hours later it would race like a horse before collapsing into weakness. It was a language the healers could not interpret, a script written by an illness they had never seen. The empire beyond the palace walls waited in tense suspension. Soldiers whispered that their king was cursed. Priests declared omens in the sky. The streets of Babylon buzzed with rumours, poison, divine punishment, rebellion. But within the chamber the truth was starker. A body slowly failing, a mind still burning, and physicians struggling in vain against an enemy their knowledge could not name. Alexander had conquered armies, rivers, mountains, and empires. Now he faced an invisible seed each day, a fresh assault. And though he commanded no retreat, his body betrayed him step by step. If you enjoyed this moment, leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you're still here with me. On the morning of June 11th, 323 BC, the royal physicians gathered in Alexander's chamber, and at last spoke the words that none of his generals wanted to hear. After nearly 2 weeks of suffering, they declared the king dead. His chest, they said, no longer rose with breath. His pulse, faint and erratic for days, had vanished beneath their trembling fingers. His voice, once the roar of armies, had been reduced to silence. And so in the official records of the empire, Alexander of Macedon, conqueror of the known world, was gone. But what followed unsettled even the hardest soldiers and the most seasoned healers. A corpse in Babylon's June heat should have quickly surrendered to nature. The Mesopotamian summer could reach over 40 degrees more than 100 degrees. Even royalty laid upon silken couches and cooled by fans was not exempt from the laws of decay. Within hours of death, the skin of an ordinary man would grow waxen and grey. Within a day, the belly would swell, the odour of corruption filling the chamber. By the second day, discoloration and collapse would betray the body's fragility. And yet Alexander's body did none of these things. By the first day after his supposed death, attendants noticed something strange. His face still retained its colour. There was no pallor, no sickly green or black creeping across the skin. By the second day, the generals whispered to one another that his limbs had not stiffened in the way corpses usually did. By the third and fourth days, the silence in the chamber grew heavier, for even the physicians could no longer pretend that this was ordinary. Alexander's features remained unnervingly lifelike. His body seemed almost to glow in the lamplight. And most disturbing of all, there were moments when his skin felt warm, not with the steady heat of fever, but with an intermittent fluctuating warmth, as though the conqueror had not fully abandoned his flesh. The Egyptian embalmers who arrived on the 6th day to begin preservation were seasoned men, heirs to millennia of funerary science. They had prepared the bodies of Pharaoh's priests and generals, and they knew well the stench and collapse of ordinary death. When they looked upon Alexander, they recoiled. According to later accounts, they remarked that the king's body seemed untouched by time. One recorded that his complexion remained as though he merely slept, his lips still tinged with life. It was unlike anything they had encountered. In the unforgiving climate of Babylon, 6 days without corruption was not simply unusual, it was impossible. Whispers spread like wildfire through the palace. Had the king's divine blood preserved him? Was this proof that Zeus Ammon truly claimed him as son? Or, and this was whispered more quietly, still had he been declared dead too soon? The thought lingered in the minds of all who had sat by his bedside, his sharp eyes, his lucid voice, his relentless clarity even as his body failed. Could it be that the physicians pressed by generals anxious for succession had mistaken the stillness of paralysis for the stillness of death? The generals struggled to reconcile what they saw. For men who had followed Alexander through storms and deserts, who had watched him survive wounds that should have killed him, this refusal of the body to yield to decay seemed in keeping with his legend. Of course he would defy even death. Yet the practical minds among them were disturbed. They knew that embalming must begin swiftly before nature's rot destroyed even the greatest of kings. But how could they begin cutting, draining and sealing a body that looked as if it still breathed in secret? Babylon's courtiers recorded their unease in hushed notes. Some wrote of lamps that seemed to flicker when placed near him, as though his presence disturbed the air. Others noted how servants hesitated to approach, fearing they might touch him and feel warmth. Even the soldiers guarding the chamber crossed themselves in the old Macedonian way before entering, muttering prayers to Heracles and Dionysus. The physicians offered explanations rooted in their knowledge of humours and pneuma. Perhaps his fever had cooked the body in such a way as to slow its decay. Perhaps his divine heritage allowed his form to resist corruption. Perhaps they said the embalming could proceed without sacrilege, for what looked like life was merely an illusion. But beneath their calm words lurked fear. They knew as well as the embalmers that bodies did not behave like this. Alexander had been declared dead, yet he refused in body, if not in voice, to behave as the dead should. And this uncanny persistence of life, or what appeared to be life, would spark centuries of speculation, feeding rumours that the greatest conqueror in history had not gone quietly into death, but had hovered on its threshold, trapped in silence, watching as the world decided his fate. For more than 2 millennia, scholars, physicians and historians puzzled over the strange reports of Alexander's death. The agony in his stomach, the creeping paralysis, the days of apparent death without decay. Many explanations were offered: malaria, typhoid poison, even divine punishment. Yet none fully accounted for the most disturbing detail, that his mind remained sharp while his body collapsed around him. Only in the modern age has a diagnosis emerged that ties these threads into a single chilling tapestry. The condition is called Guillain-Barré syndrome, or GBS. Today we understand it as a rare autoimmune disorder, a case of the body turning its defenses against itself. For reasons still not fully clear, the immune system, normally tasked with fighting off infections, attacks the peripheral nerves that carry signals between the brain and muscles. The result is terrifying muscles weaken from the ground up, beginning with tingling in the feet and legs, then creeping upward in a slow, relentless march. What starts as weakness can become full paralysis in days. And yet through all of this, the mind remains untouched. Consciousness, memory, reasoning, these stay intact. Patients know exactly what is happening. They can see it and think clearly, but their bodies betray them step by step. The cruelest twist is that in severe cases, even the muscles of breathing are paralyzed. To those without modern machines, ventilators monitors oxygen, such a patient appears to have slipped into death. No movement, no speech, no visible breath. Now imagine such a condition in Babylon in 323 BC. Physicians relied on sight, touch, and sound to judge life or death. They felt for a pulse, they watched the chest rise, they held a mirror before the lips to catch the fog of breath. They had no stethoscopes, no instruments to detect the faintest signs of life. In a man with GBS whose breathing was shallow to the point of invisibility, whose body was paralyzed yet whose mind remained painfully awake, it would have been easy, too easy to mistake life for death. The ancient accounts align disturbingly well with what modern neurologists recognize. The ascending weakness described by Plutarch and Aryan legs, first then arms, then chest, is textbook GBS. The fevers, the abdominal agony, the steady clarity of thought amidst physical ruin, these two match clinical descriptions. And then the most haunting piece, the preservation of the body after death. GBS patients, when their breathing fails, may linger in a suspended state where the heart still beats weakly, body temperature fluctuates, and outward signs of death are masked. For ancient embalmers, Alexander's lifelike appearance would not have been a miracle but a tragic misdiagnosis. The modern medical world has witnessed cases that cast light back on Alexander's plight. In the 20th century, physicians recorded patients with GBS who became locked in, unable to move or speak their minds fully intact. Some could only communicate with the slightest flicker of the eyes. In one case, a man was declared comatose for months, only to later reveal he had been aware of everything imprisoned within his silent body. These modern parallels make the ancient reports more than superstition, they make them plausible. Consider the terror Alexander may have endured. To lie still while his generals debated succession, to hear his physicians whisper of poisons and omens, to feel the embalmers approach their instruments ready. Unable to lift a finger, unable to cry out, he would have been a prisoner in his own flesh, his brilliant mind forced to witness the collapse of all he had built. This diagnosis does not strip the mystery from Alexander's death. On the contrary, it deepens it. It suggests that the conqueror who seemed to defy mortality may have suffered not a swift assassination or a feverish delirium, but something far more human and far more horrifying to be mistaken for dead while fully alive. In a world without the tools to know otherwise, his final battle was not against men or empires, but against the silence of his own body. Step back from the bedside of the dying king and look instead at the way he was remembered in metal and stone. Across the Hellenistic world, coins bearing Alexander's image circulated like portable shrines. His profile, clean-shaven hair tumbling in leonine curls, gaze lifted toward the heavens, became one of the most reproduced faces of antiquity. Yet to the trained eye, these portraits hold subtle irregularities that have sparked debate among modern scholars. On several surviving tetradrachms, Alexander's neck is shown at a slight tilt, his chin subtly raised as though he perpetually carried his head askew. Sculptural busts echo this same posture. The turn is elegant, dramatic, but also unnatural. Was this purely artistic convention designed to mark him as touched by divinity eyes lifted towards Zeus, or was it a faithful rendering of a physical condition? Some medical historians argue the latter. They note asymmetry in his face on coins struck during his lifetime. One eye appears slightly more open than the other, the mouth faintly uneven. When combined with the head tilt, these features suggest the possibility of a congenital or spinal disorder, perhaps Klippel-Feil syndrome, a rare condition involving fused cervical vertebrae that shortens the neck and restricts movement. Others see signs of scoliosis or another structural irregularity that might have left Alexander prone to musculoskeletal strain and later in life neurological complications. If true, these anomalies add a poignant note to his story. The man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders may have done so with a body already marked by fragility. A shortened neck could have altered nerve pathways, while spinal deformities might have made him more susceptible to paralysis when illness struck. His famous head tilt, long celebrated as a symbol of heroic aspiration, could instead mask an inherited vulnerability. Yet caution is vital. Numismatics and sculpture are treacherous guides to diagnosis. Ancient engravers were craftsmen, not medical illustrators. They often stylized features to communicate character-wide eyes for divine vision, tilted heads for noble striving, exaggerated musculature for power. Just as Roman emperors had themselves depicted with youthful vigour long after age stooped their backs, Alexander's image was as much propaganda as portrait. What appears to us as asymmetry may have been the engraver's shorthand for charisma. What seems like a pathological tilt could be artistic convention copied so often it hardened into canon. Still, the convergence of multiple media coins, busts, and contemporary descriptions keeps the question alive. Plutarch, writing centuries later, remarked that Alexander's gaze seemed to burn with unusual intensity, as though his head and eyes did not rest like other men's. Was this a writer embellishing the awe of greatness, or was it the memory of a very real posture immortalized by those who had seen him in life? Retrodiagnosis is always fraught. Historians tread a narrow path between insight and anachronism. To graft modern medical categories onto ancient figures risks distortion. Yet to ignore the evidence entirely is to dismiss the ways in which the body itself shapes destiny. If Alexander's anatomy carried hidden flaws, then the conqueror who seemed untouchable may have been all along more vulnerable than legend allowed. In the gleam of silver coins and the marble sheen of sculpted portraits, we glimpse not only the heroic mask, but perhaps faint traces of the human beneath a man whose tilted head and uneven features whisper of fragility, and whose final illness may have exploited those very cracks in his foundation. When the embalmers finally approached Alexander's body, they did so with the reverence of men summoned to preserve not merely a king, but a living god. Egypt had perfected the art of embalming for nearly 3 millennia, and now its masters stood before the most famous corpse of the ancient world. What they confronted, however, was no ordinary challenge. His flesh remained strangely lifelike, refusing to surrender to rot even in the choking heat of Babylon. Yet the task was the same: to make his preservation not a miracle of chance, but the work of deliberate human craft. At the centre of their arsenal was honey. To modern science, its properties are clear. Raw honey is hostile to bacteria. Its high sugar content dehydrates microbes, its acidity discourages growth, and it produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide that sterilize the tissue it coats. For ancient mortuary specialists, these effects were not chemical formulae, but sacred wisdom known by experience. Honey was both food of the gods and preservative of kings. Alexander's attendants are said to have packed his body in honey during its transport sealing, in flesh and aura alike. But honey was only the beginning. The embalmers carried resins and gums from across the empire, myrrh from Arabia, frankincense from Somalia, cedar oil from Lebanon, cassia and cinnamon from India. Each of these substances had antimicrobial properties, though the Egyptians understood them as gifts of divinity materials infused with sacred fire. Myrrh hardened into a protective crust over skin. Cedar oil penetrated deep into tissue, drying it without destroying form. Frankincense masked odour and symbolically purified corruption. When combined, they created a chemical shield against the most relentless forces of decay. The supply chains behind these ingredients were themselves imperial marvels. Caravans crossed deserts with sacks of resin lashed to camel humps. Ships navigated the Red Sea, their holds fragrant with cargo that would fetch a pharaoh's ransom. To embalm Alexander was not simply a technical task, but a political statement. Only a man whose dominion stretched across the known world could command ingredients drawn from its furthest edges. In his preservation, the geography of empire was distilled into chemistry. Timing, however, was everything. In Egyptian practice, embalming began swiftly, often within a day of death, before putrefaction could set in. The body was eviscerated organs dried in natron cavities filled with resins. Yet with Alexander, hesitation clouded the process. His generals quarrelled over succession, and his uncanny refusal to decay led many to delay intervention. To cut into a body that looked alive was not only sacrilege, it risked confirming whispers that he was not truly dead. By the time the embalmers were permitted to begin their craft, they were working not against ordinary decay, but against a mystery. Some scholars suggest this delay may have paradoxically aided his preservation. If Alexander truly suffered from the paralysis of Guillain-Barré syndrome, his heart may have continued a faint rhythm long after physicians declared him dead. Embalming, begun at that moment while his body still circulated some vestige of life, could have locked his tissues into a state that mimicked immortality. To the embalmers who saw his flesh remain pliant, his complexion still tinged with warmth, it must have seemed as though they were working on a god who had chosen to linger between worlds. The embalming itself became a work of theatre as much as science. Oils were poured, prayers chanted, the body wrapped in linen, steeped with resins. Each layer sealed Alexander further into a paradox, dead yet lifelike, absent yet present. When at last his body was placed into a golden sarcophagus, later replaced with crystal to ore. Visitors, the preservation was so flawless that centuries later Roman emperors still bent to kiss his brow. The science of immortality was not only chemical, it was cultural. Honey, myrrh, cedar, frankincense, substances both practical and symbolic, carrying with them the idea that death could be tamed if not defeated. For Alexander, they achieved something no battlefield had granted him, a victory over time itself, or at least the illusion of one. The death of Alexander left his generals with a kingdom too vast for one man to inherit and a body too sacred to ignore. At first, the plan seemed simple: return him to Macedonia, where his father Philip II had been buried at Aegi. There, amid the royal tombs of his ancestors, Alexander would lie in eternal continuity with the dynasty that birthed him. A massive funeral carriage was commissioned, more a rolling palace than a bier. Contemporary accounts describe it as gilded with gold, encrusted with jewels, painted with scenes of his conquests, and pulled by a train of mules adorned in silver harnesses. It was less a procession of mourning than a moving monument, a declaration that even in death Alexander remained the centre of empire. But in the world of the Diadochi, the successors' funerals were never merely funerals. To command Alexander's body was to command his aura. In the ancient imagination, the corpse of a great king was not inert flesh, but a talisman of legitimacy. Whoever laid him to rest could claim the blessing of his spirit, the mantle of his authority, the right to rule in his shadow. And so, as the funeral cortege wound its way westward from Babylon, it became not simply a procession, but the most coveted prize in the Mediterranean. It was Ptolemy, son of Lagus, who seized the opportunity. Once one of Alexander's trusted bodyguards, he had proven himself a shrewd commander, and an even shrewder politician. While others squabbled over territories in Asia, Ptolemy fixed his gaze on Egypt. He understood that Alexander's body could be the cornerstone of a new dynasty. If Egypt held the conqueror's remains, then Egypt, not Macedonia, would become the spiritual capital of his empire. So Ptolemy prepared a theft that was nothing short of audacious. As the great funeral carriage passed through Syria, he intercepted it with a force loyal to him alone. Ancient sources tell us that this was no skirmish but a carefully planned coup. Ptolemy's men surrounded the convoy, overwhelmed the guards, and redirected the entire cortege southward toward the Nile. It was an act of political genius disguised as piety. He announced that Alexander had always wished to be buried in Egypt, the land he had liberated from Persian rule, the land that had crowned him pharaoh at the oracle of Siwa. To the watching world, it was theatre of the highest order. Imagine the sight: an army escorting the glittering carriage through desert passes, banners snapping in the wind, priests chanting invocations, soldiers marching in solemn cadence. Commoners lined the roads, throwing flowers, bowing in reverence, convinced they were witnessing not a theft but a pilgrimage. Ptolemy knew the power of spectacle. He turned the seizure of a corpse into a triumphal procession, masking ambition with devotion. And yet beneath the pageantry was ruthless calculation. Who guards the body guards the legacy. This was an unspoken truth in the ancient world. For centuries, Egyptian pharaohs had claimed divine continuity by burying themselves among gods and ancestors. For Rome, the ashes of heroes were paraded to secure the Senate's will. In every culture, the corpse of a king was more than bone and sinew. It was sovereignty incarnate. Ptolemy understood this better than any of Alexander's companions. By controlling the tomb, he would control memory itself. When the glittering procession finally entered Egypt, it was not just Alexander who crossed the border. It was legitimacy, reverence, and the gravitational pull of empire. Babylon had declared him dead, but in Ptolemy's hands Alexander's body lived on as a weapon, as a relic, and as the keystone of a dynasty that would endure for 3 centuries on the banks of the Nile. When Ptolemy's audacious theft was complete and Alexander's coffin finally reached Egypt, the work of political alchemy began. To claim Alexander's body was one thing, to transform it into a perpetual source of legitimacy and awe was another. Ptolemy and his descendants understood this instinctively. They would not merely bury the conqueror, they would enshrine him. Alexandria, the city. Alexander himself had founded on the Nile's delta would now hold its founder's flesh, becoming at once a mausoleum, a temple, and a treasury of political capital. The shrine that rose in the royal quarter was unlike any tomb the Mediterranean had seen. Egyptian embalmers had already perfected the science of preserving flesh, but here their mastery was combined with Hellenistic ambition and architectural ingenuity. The tomb was designed as a kind of long-term biodome, a sealed environment where death could be contained and majesty displayed. Climate control was paramount. The architects knew that Egypt's heat could consume a body in days if left unchecked, so they built chambers sunk deep below ground level, insulated by layers of stone that kept the air cool. Ventilation shafts were cut in carefully measured angles, drawing in breezes from the sea while funneling out stagnant air. These shafts worked like primitive air conditioning circulating currents to regulate temperature and moisture. Without such airflow, mould and damp would have destroyed even the finest embalming. Drainage was equally vital. The Nile's waters made Alexandria a city of abundance, but also of risk. Seasonal floods could seep into tombs and rot what lay within. Engineers laid sloped floors and hidden channels that carried away any intruding water, ensuring the chamber stayed dry. The very stones chosen for construction bore antimicrobial qualities, dense limestone and imported alabaster, that resisted decay not only for their beauty but for their practicality. To the ancient eye, these were sacred materials. To modern science, they were also subtle weapons against bacteria. At the heart of the shrine stood the sarcophagus itself. At first, it was golden, a dazzling chest that declared Alexander's divine status. Later, when the gold was melted down in leaner years, it was replaced with a crystal or glass coffin. This was no accident. The Ptolemies wanted Alexander not hidden but displayed. The sarcophagus became a window, a literal stage on which his preserved body could be seen by pilgrims and dignitaries. Visitors would descend into the chamber and behold him still lifelike, still formidable, his features seemingly untouched by time. For many it was not a corpse, but a vision of immortality. The shrine quickly became a magnet. Pilgrims arrived from across the Mediterranean carrying offerings to lay before the conqueror's body. Dignitaries from rival kingdoms sought audience not only with Egypt's rulers, but with Alexander himself, believing that kneeling before his preserved face conferred a blessing or at the very least legitimacy to their cause. Even Roman emperors would later make the journey. Augustus is said to have touched Alexander's brow, placing a wreath upon it as if communing with a fellow sovereign across the centuries. And of course there was revenue. Pilgrimage meant money. Merchants thrived, selling amulets, oil lamps, and tokens stamped with Alexander's profile. Priests and attendants collected tributes for access to the chamber. Every visitor who descended into the cool incense-laden air and gazed upon the transparent coffin not only honoured Alexander but enriched Alexandria. The shrine was both temple and treasury, sacred relic and financial engine. The architecture itself reinforced the message. Here was a tomb that outlasted flesh, a sanctuary where time slowed. The controlled air, the flowing drainage, the careful layering of preservative resins and linens, all worked in concert to sustain the illusion that Alexander had conquered even decay. The shrine was not merely a resting place. It was a political machine engineered to remind every visitor that Egypt now guarded the most precious relic of empire, and that the Ptolemies were its rightful heirs. In Alexandria's royal quarter, the body of a man became the cornerstone of a dynasty. His tomb was not built to mourn him, but to perpetuate his power-layered stone and resin airflow and ritual science and faith, all conspiring to turn death into sovereignty. Centuries after Alexander's death, long after his empire had fractured into rival kingdoms, his tomb in Alexandria remained a place of pilgrimage not only for common travellers, but for rulers who wished to measure themselves against the conqueror's ghost. To approach the coffin was to step into a theatre where politics, religion, and death entwined, and even Rome's most powerful men could not resist. When Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, entered the tomb in 30 BC after defeating Cleopatra and seizing Egypt, he performed an act both intimate and political. Ancient accounts tell us he placed a golden crown upon Alexander's preserved brow and scattered flowers over the crystal coffin. Some say he even bent to kiss the forehead of the dead king before clumsily breaking off a piece of the nose in the process. The detail may be apocryphal, but the symbolism is unmistakable. Augustus was declaring himself heir, not just to Julius Caesar, but to Alexander himself. To touch the conqueror was to claim kinship with him. What did it mean that Alexander still looked lifelike 3 centuries after Babylon? To ancient visitors it was a miracle. To modern scholars, it was the combined effect of masterful embalming climate control and the power of suggestion. Lifelike may not have meant a body untouched by time, but features intact enough to recognize the shape of the nose, the contour of the jaw, the familiar cascade of hair rendered permanent by resin and linen. In a world where corpses normally withered to bone within months, this preservation was nothing short of divine. The tomb became the centerpiece of a ritual economy. Access was carefully managed by priests and officials who controlled the royal quarter. Dignitaries arriving from across the Mediterranean paid vast sums to enter the chamber. They emerged, having seen with their own eyes what legend promised Alexander, still present, still commanding. For kings and ambassadors, the experience conferred prestige, a visible mark of having stood in the aura of the world's greatest conqueror. For the Ptolemies and later for Rome, this ritual economy was a political goldmine. Alexander's body was more than relic. It was a diplomatic instrument. To allow a ruler to touch the coffin was to grant him legitimacy. To deny access was to remind him who truly guarded the divine king's legacy. Every offering, every wreath, every coin placed before the crystal sarcophagus reaffirmed Alexandria's role as keeper of the world's most sacred corpse. The politics of proximity were profound. In an age when kingship itself was often framed as semi-divine, Alexander's lifelike body became a measuring rod. To lay hands upon it was to bridge the gap between human and God, to borrow the charisma of a man whose gaze had once terrified Darius, whose campaigns had redrawn the map of civilization. Augustus knew it. So did the emperors who followed men who, even while commanding legions of their own, still felt the need to kneel before a body that refused to vanish. Thus the tomb was not merely a mausoleum, it was a stage where the drama of power was performed again and again, each visitor adding another layer to the myth. Alexander was long dead, but in the cool incense-heavy chamber of Alexandria, he continued to rule not by the sword but by the silent persistence of his preserved flesh and the prestige of those who dared to touch the untouchable. Whispers of poison swirled through Babylon almost as soon as Alexander collapsed at the banquet table. To his generals, to his soldiers, even to his subjects, it was easier to believe the conqueror of the world had been struck down by human treachery than by an invisible illness. Poison had a narrative power that disease did not. It suggested agency, betrayal, a plot as grand as the man it felled. Ancient sources diverge in their accounts. Some claim that rival generals, perhaps Antipater, perhaps Cassander, sent agents bearing venom distilled from exotic plants. Others suggest that enemies within Babylon Persians, resentful of their new master, slipped something into his wine. Still others whispered that Aristotle himself, Alexander's old tutor, had provided the knowledge. In every version, poison was a convenient villain, a way to explain the sudden agony that doubled Alexander over at the feast. But here is where the chronology falters. The most feared toxins of antiquity, Hellebor's aconite hemlock, worked swiftly and brutally. Hellebore, for example, was known across Greece as both medicine and poison, a purgative that, in excess, caused violent vomiting convulsions and swift collapse. Aconite wolf's bane could numb and paralyze, but usually killed within hours. Hemlock used to execute Socrates, led to gradual paralysis, but brought death within a day, not a fortnight. None of these plants could account for Alexander's prolonged decline. Days of fever-creeping paralysis, a mind that stayed razor-sharp even as breath failed. The puzzle is even clearer when considering his preserved cognition. Poisons that induce paralysis typically cloud the mind, causing delirium or unconsciousness long before the body fails. Yet every account of Alexander's final illness emphasizes his clarity, how he continued to issue orders, recognize friends, and make decisions. Plant toxins struggle to explain this eerie preservation of intellect. To the ancient imagination, however, poison was less about chemical reality than about the politics of suspicion. Poison could mean any sudden misfortune. A fever might be blamed on a rival's draft, a seizure on an enemy's herb. In royal courts where power changed hands as swiftly as goblets of wine, the idea of poison was irresistible. It turned natural death into murder, misfortune into conspiracy. And in a succession crisis, conspiracy was always the safer story to tell, because it placed blame on rivals rather than admitting that the gods or fate could strike down a king at random. The danger of these whispers was immense. If Alexander had been poisoned, then trust among his generals shattered instantly. Any companion might be an assassin. Any cup might conceal betrayal. Rumors hardened into paranoia and paranoia into preemptive strikes. The wars of succession that tore apart his empire were fueled as much by suspicion as by ambition. In truth, the symptoms recorded by ancient writers align more closely with paralysis than poison. The slow progression from feet to chest, the unclouded mind, the fluctuating fever all point away from a single dose of toxin and toward a disorder of the nervous system. But for the soldiers and courtiers in Babylon, paralysis was a mystery they could not name. Poison, in contrast, was a story they understood. It fit their world of palace intrigue and shadowy plots. It gave meaning to the inexplicable. Thus, whether or not a poison ever touched Alexander's lips, the idea of it became part of his legend. A conqueror too great to be defeated by disease undone instead by the darker hand of conspiracy. A story not of paralysis, but of betrayal. And in the end, perhaps that story was more dangerous than the illness itself, for it set the stage for decades of mistrust, bloodshed, and war. In the summer of 323 BC, when Alexander lay motionless on his Babylonian couch, the royal physicians faced a problem that was as much philosophical as medical. How do you know with certainty when life has ended? To us, the answer seems obvious. Machines can detect the faintest breath, the weakest pulse, the flicker of brain activity. But to the ancients, life and death were judged by outward signs alone, fragile indicators that could deceive even the most seasoned healer. The standard tests were simple. First, the breath a physician would place a feather or a polished bronze mirror before the lips to see if the slightest mist appeared. If the surface remained clear, they assumed the lungs had fallen silent. Second, the pulse fingers pressed to the wrist or neck, feeling for the rhythm of life. But pulses could be faint, fleeting, or masked by fever. Third, the eyes a lamp shone to see whether pupils contracted or whether the gaze had become fixed in the glassy stare of the dead. Greek medical texts even recognized strange states in which the body mimicked death. Writers of the Hippocratic tradition described catalepsis, rigid immobility, where a patient seemed frozen, unresponsive, yet alive within. Others wrote of coma-like conditions where breathing was imperceptible, the body cool, the spirit hidden. These descriptions show that the ancients knew death could be imitated, but they lacked the tools to distinguish imitation from truth. For Alexander's physicians, the stakes could not have been higher. Every general, every soldier, every priest waited on their verdict. If they delayed too long, they risked angering the commanders who needed to secure succession before the army splintered. If they declared death too soon, they risked violating the most sacred trust of medicine to do no harm. In this crucible of expectation, certainty was a luxury they could not afford. The pressure warped judgment. The generals paced outside the chamber, whispering of mutiny and rebellion if no decision was reached. The army grew restless, their loyalty tethered to a leader who might already be gone. In such an atmosphere, hesitation was dangerous. A physician's word could decide not only the fate of a patient but the stability of an empire. And so when Alexander's body lay still, his chest barely moving, his voice already fallen to silence, they declared what everyone demanded: the king was dead. Yet imagine the weight on those physicians. To touch Alexander's wrist and find no pulse, to watch his chest and see no breath, to peer into his eyes and see only glassy stillness. These were the signs they had always been taught. But what if his pulse was only too faint, his breath too shallow, his awareness locked deep inside? They could not know. They could only choose. And so in a moment of haste born of fear, ambition and urgency, they drew a line between life and death that may not have been true. They gave permission for embalming to begin, for generals to debate succession, for the machinery of empire to grind forward. Their verdict ended a reign. But if modern medicine is correct, Alexander may still have been there, silent, paralyzed, but fully conscious, listening as the world consigned him to eternity. It is a thin line that bordered between life and death. In Babylon, under the weight of political urgency, it may have been crossed too soon. And in that crossing, a tragedy unfolded that still haunts the corridors of history. Imagine for a moment the mind of Alexander the Great in those final days, sharp as ever, yet bound inside a body that had turned to stone. He could think, he could remember, he could feel the weight of time pressing on him, but he could not move a hand, could not form a word. To be Alexander was to command, to shout across battlefields, to lead men into impossible storms, to bend empires to his will. And now, as the voices of his generals filled the chamber, debating who would inherit his world, he could only listen, unable to answer, trapped in a silence more brutal than any wound. If Guillain-Barré syndrome explains his fate, then Alexander may have lain there in a state we now call locked in consciousness. his eyes perhaps fluttering, his breath so shallow it seemed absent, his limbs paralyzed, yet his awareness painfully intact. The debates over succession. Perdiccas pressing his claim, Ptolemy calculating Seleucus and Antigonus, weighing their chances, would have reached his ears clearly. To hear his empire being divided like spoils at a gaming table while unable to speak a single word in defense of his vision would have been a torment unlike any battlefield loss. There is something profoundly tragic in imagining Alexander's mind racing with thoughts, memories, and strategies as his generals whispered of betrayal and ambition. He who had faced down war elephants and stormed the gates of Tyre could do nothing to check the disintegration of the empire he had built. His whole life had been a series of decisive actions, lightning-quick maneuvers, and audacious gambles. Now his final act was forced passivity. Worse still was the approach of the embalmers. To feel hands upon his skin, to sense the cold touch of oils and resins, to hear prayers spoken over him. What must that have been like if his mind still clung to awareness? Perhaps he tried to will a finger to twitch, a mouth to move, but nothing responded. Perhaps he screamed within, only to find that no sound emerged. The conqueror, who had once felt the thunder of hooves under him, who had laughed amid the din of swords, now lay utterly mute as strangers prepared his body for eternity. And yet one must tread carefully here. It is tempting to sensationalize, to dwell on horror. But what deserves reflection is the humanity of that possible experience. Alexander, for all his legend, was still a man who may have faced the most humbling of human conditions, to be reduced to thought alone, denied even the dignity of gesture. For someone accustomed to absolute command, it was the ultimate inversion. There is also a strange dignity in the thought. If he remained aware, then Alexander bore those last days with the same steel he had shown in life. He endured helplessness as he once endured wounds. He listened as his empire fractured, and perhaps in some final act of internal sovereignty he refused to spare. To be conscious in silence yet unbroken in mind is its own kind of defiance. We will never know what he felt in those final moments, whether he drifted in peace or whether he raged inwardly against the prison of his body. But the possibility forces us to see him not only as conqueror, but as man. Not in armour, not astride Bucephalus, but lying still watching history move on without him. That silence, more than his victories, may be what makes his story resonate across millennia. The reminder that even the greatest among us can be rendered powerless, and that in such moments humanity is revealed in its rawest form. As Alexander's body lay still in Babylon, the chamber outside his bedchamber transformed into the first battlefield of a new war. His generals' men who had followed him across deserts and mountains, who had shared his triumphs and nearly died in his gambles, were now rivals circling like wolves. Their king could not rise, perhaps could not even speak yet. Their eyes were already fixed on the glittering map of his empire. The tradition preserved by ancient writers tells us that Alexander, when asked to whom he left his kingdom, whispered 2 words toi kratistoi, to the strongest. Some accounts claim he said nothing at all, only gestured faintly. Others insist the words were reported later, shaped by a memory and ambition. What if in truth he was already locked inside his body, unable to speak, his ignorance misheard as consent? Whatever the reality, those ambiguous last words became weapons sharper than any sword. For to leave an empire to the strongest was no bequest, it was a challenge. It was as though Alexander had lit the fuse of civil war with his final breath, or worse, that his companions had placed the match themselves, inventing a command their dying king could not refute. Either way, it gave each general permission to claim greatness by force. The uncertainty of his funeral only deepened the fracture. Should his body be carried to Macedonia to rest among his ancestors? Should it remain in Babylon, the centre of his last campaigns? Or should it be taken to Egypt, the land that had crowned him pharaoh and declared him divine? These disagreements were not ceremonial squabbles, they were declarations of sovereignty. To possess Alexander's corpse was to possess his legacy, and so even before his body left Babylon, the empire was already breaking. The map of the ancient world began to splinter. Perdiccas, named regent, sought to hold the empire together under Alexander's infant son. Ptolemy seized Egypt, staking his claim with the body itself. Seleucus took Bailon and the eastern satrapies, while Antigonus Monophthalmus claimed Asia Minor. Lysimachus carved out Thrace, while Cassander tightened his grip on Macedon. Each man draped himself in Alexander's memory, while hacking away a piece of his inheritance. From the Indus to the Nile, the cohesion Alexander had forced through charisma and conquest dissolved into decades of bloodshed. Battles raged at Ipsus Gaza and Corupedium. Cities changed masters again and again. Soldiers who had once marched side by side under the same banner now cut each other down in service of competing heirs. The wars of the Diadochi were not only a struggle for land, they were a struggle for the meaning of Alexander himself. And the irony is cruel. If Alexander had indeed been aware in his final days, locked inside his silent body, he may have heard the first whispers of this unravelling as his generals argued over succession. He may have recognised with agonising clarity that the empire he had built with sweat and blood would not survive him intact. The ambiguous words attributed to him to the strongest were both prophecy and curse. They ignited a generation of conflict, reshaping the Mediterranean world into kingdoms that bore his name in fragments but not in unity. Out of his silence rose dynasties, wars and legends. Out of his stillness came the storm that would redefine an age. For centuries after Alexander's death, his tomb in Alexandria was one of the most famous landmarks of the ancient world. Pilgrims, kings and emperors came to gaze upon the conqueror's preserved form, to touch the coffin that radiated both awe and legitimacy. Yet today not a trace of it survives. The mausoleum that once drew the powerful of 3 continents has vanished as though swallowed by the earth. This disappearance is itself one of history's great mysteries, an absence that has fed legend as hungrily as the body once fed dynasties. The first hints of loss appear in late antiquity. Roman emperors as late as the 3rd century still recorded visiting the tomb, still described the body's lifelike features. But by the time of the Christian emperors, references grow vague. Some said the crystal coffin was replaced by a simpler sarcophagus of alabaster. Others claimed it had been hidden away for protection. By the rise of Islam in Egypt, mentions of Alexander's resting place become muddled with local traditions folded into stories of Iskander, the world conqueror of the Quranic imagination. The shrine that had once anchored Alexandria's royal quarter seemed to fade from memory. Why did it vanish? Part of the answer lies beneath the soil. Cities are living organisms, constantly rebuilding, burying their past beneath new layers. Alexandria in particular was battered by earthquakes, swallowed by floods, and reshaped by centuries of rulers who built over the ruins of their predecessors. The royal quarter that once housed Alexander's tomb now lies beneath the modern city, hidden under streets, mosques, and apartment blocks. Archaeologists who drill into the bedrock find layer upon layer of occupation, each one sealing away the geography of the Ptolemies. Sacred geography itself shifts with time. What was once holy becomes forgotten when regimes change. The Christians of late antiquity had little interest in preserving a pagan tomb, even one so storied. Later Islamic rulers folded Alexander into their own traditions, but made no effort to maintain the Greek Macedonian mausoleum. What was once the beating heart of dynastic legitimacy became irrelevant to new rulers with new gods and new narratives. Like so many ancient sanctuaries, it crumbled not through a single act of destruction, but through centuries of neglect and repurposing. Still, the memory persisted, fragmented, distorted but alive. Byzantine chroniclers mentioned the tomb in passing, though often confusing its location. Medieval Arab geographers spoke of Alexander's resting place with reverence, though often blending it with legends of his journeys to the ends of the earth. European travellers in the Middle Ages, hungry for relics of antiquity, wrote wildly contradictory accounts. Some claimed the tomb still stood in Alexandria. Others insisted it had been moved to Constantinople, or even Venice. Texts preserved much, but they also muddled. Each retelling layered imagination upon reality, myth upon memory. By the Renaissance, Alexander's tomb was less an object of archaeology than of legend, invoked by scholars and dreamers as a symbol of vanished grandeur. Its very absence gave it power. What could not be found became what everyone sought. And so the tomb of Alexander the Great, once a dazzling centerpiece of empire, once the stage where emperors bent in awe slipped into silence. Its stones may lie beneath the streets of Alexandria, still its chambers collapsed and waterlogged. Or perhaps it was dismantled, its sarcophagus melted, its relics scattered to the winds. We do not know. What endures is the legend, a body that refused to decay, a shrine that anchored dynasties, and a mystery that has refused for nearly 2,000 years to be buried. In the last century, the mystery of Alexander's vanished tomb has become less the work of poets and chroniclers, and more the domain of archaeologists armed with technology that would have seemed like sorcery to the ancients. Alexandria, sprawling and modern, sits atop the royal quarter where the conqueror's shrine once stood. Excavators cannot simply tear up whole neighbourhoods in search of him. Instead, they peer beneath the earth with instruments designed to reveal what human eyes cannot see. Ground-penetrating radar GPR is one of their most potent tools. It works by sending pulses of radio waves into the soil and measuring how they bounce back. Solid walls, chambers, and voids reflect differently from loose sand or stone rubble. By analysing the patterns, archaeologists can map what lies beneath streets and courtyards without ever lifting a spade. In Alexandria's ancient heart, GPR has revealed curious anomalies. Rectangular voids suggestive of corridors, deep hollows shaped like burial chambers, outlines of what may be colonnaded halls. To the hopeful eye, these look like ghosted chambers, remnants of the Ptolemaic necropolis. Electromagnetic surveys add another layer. These measure subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field caused by buried structures. Stone walls, fired bricks, and even ancient metal deposits disturb the soil's magnetism in detectable ways. Combined with GPR, they allow archaeologists to form three-dimensional maps of the underground world, networks of rooms, passages, and collapsed vaults, all hidden beneath layers of later construction. But perhaps the most tantalizing evidence has come from chemical analysis of soil samples. In certain anomalies under Alexandria, scientists have detected traces of substances the ancients prized for embalming beeswax honey resins, such as myrrh and frankincense. Honey in particular leaves a chemical signature that persists across centuries, its sugars and compounds absorbed into the earth. Myrrh and cedar oil leave faint aromatic residues that can be measured with modern instruments. These discoveries match the very recipes described in ancient texts for preserving royal bodies. It is easy in the glow of such findings to leap to conclusions. News headlines have proclaimed Alexander's tomb found more times than any sober archaeologist cares to count. But professionals caution a promising anomaly is not a confirmed tomb. Radar can reveal cavities, but it cannot tell us who was buried there. Chemical residues suggest embalming, but embalming was common in Egypt for millennia. A chamber beneath the streets may belong to a Ptolemaic noble, a Roman official, or even a temple storeroom. Archaeology, unlike legend, thrives on patience. Excavation in Alexandria is painstaking, complicated by the fact that modern buildings, mosques, and homes sit directly atop ancient remains. To reach a chamber, one must often tunnel through living neighbourhoods, an effort fraught with logistical and political challenges. And even if a sarcophagus were found, identification would demand DNA comparison with known Macedonian royal remains, a process vulnerable to contamination and uncertainty. Still, the tools have opened doors. Where once scholars relied only on texts and rumour, they can now map with precision what lies beneath. The ghosted chambers glimpsed in radar scans and the chemical signatures of honey and resin offer a tantalizing possibility that Alexander's shrine may not be lost forever, but sleeping beneath Alexandria, waiting for cautious hands and disciplined science to uncover it. For now, the anomalies remain just that, shadows, echoes, promises in the earth. They remind us that between legend and proof lies a wide and patient gulf, one that technology narrows but cannot yet cross. If one day archaeologists finally break into a sealed chamber beneath Alexandria and find a sarcophagus holding a remarkably preserved body, the world would hold its breath. It would be the greatest archaeological discovery of the modern age, greater perhaps than Tutankhamun's tomb. But the question would come swiftly, is it truly Alexander? And answering that would demand not poetry or legend, but science. The first step would be identification. Modern forensic teams would compare the remains against what is already known of Alexander's Macedonian lineage. His father Philip II of Macedon, whose bones are believed to lie in the royal tombs at Vergina, provides a potential genetic anchor. DNA samples, if extractable, could be compared to establish biological kinship, but even this is fraught. Contamination is a constant risk, and ancient DNA degrades easily, especially after 2 millennia in shifting soils. To avoid false results, laboratories would need to follow rigorous chain of custody protocols with multiple teams working independently to confirm findings. Beyond genetics, imaging technology could probe the body itself. CT scans and MRIs used today on mummies can reveal skeletal deformities, spinal anomalies, and even traces of neurological damage. If Alexander truly had a congenital neck disorder, as coins and statues suggest, imaging might show fused cervical vertebrae or asymmetries that match the ancient depictions. Signs of paralysis, nerve damage, or respiratory stress could leave indirect traces in bone or soft tissue. These would not prove Guillain-Barré syndrome outright, but they might align with the descriptions of ascending paralysis and preserved cognition that haunted his final days. Chemical residue analysis would provide another window. Embalming compounds absorbed into wrappings and bone could reveal what methods were used to preserve him. Honey, cedar oil, myrrh, and frankincense each leave distinct chemical signatures. If these matched the descriptions of Alexander's extraordinary preservation, it would lend weight to the identification. More intriguingly, forensic chemistry could also test for traces of toxins, reviving the ancient poison theories with evidence rather than rumour. Yet sober expectations must temper the imagination. Identification is not simple. DNA comparison may be inconclusive, embalming chemicals may obscure medical evidence, and centuries of looting, flooding, or fire could have compromised what remains. Even if a body is found in Alexandria, and even if it bears signs consistent with Alexander's known image, certainty may remain elusive. The line between probability and proof is thin, and archaeologists know how dangerous hype can be. There are also ethical questions. Alexander is not merely a historical figure, he is a world symbol. To cut, probe, and test his body raises profound concerns. Who has the right to authorize such research, Greece as his homeland, Egypt as his resting place, or the global scholarly community in the name of science? And what of reverence should a man once worshipped as divine be treated as an object of dissection? These debates already simmer in the halls of archaeology, and a discovery of this magnitude would ignite them worldwide. Still, the potential knowledge is staggering. Finding Alexander could confirm or disprove millennia of speculation about his death, his health, his preservation. It could illuminate ancient embalming science at its peak, reveal the lived biology of one of history's most mythic figures, and close a chapter that has haunted both medicine and history for 2,000 years. But until that moment arrives, the possibility remains only that a threshold glimpsed but not yet crossed. History remembers Alexander as a man who never lost a battle, who carved his empire with speed and daring, who seemed invincible even to the gods. Yet in the end it was not spear or sword that felled him, not the cunning of enemies or the betrayal of friends, but something quieter and more merciless, the failure of medicine to understand what it could not see. A paralysis mistaken for death, a silence misread as absence, a body embalmed while perhaps still clinging to life. There is something profoundly human in this ending. The greatest conqueror of antiquity undone not by destiny but by uncertainty, by physicians forced to decide under impossible pressure, by generals impatient for succession, by the weight of politics moving faster than the rhythms of the body. His empire unravelled as swiftly as his breath, carved apart by men who may have misheard his last words or invented them outright. In that tragic haste, a world was reshaped. The lesson is sobering. Misdiagnosis is not just a medical error, it can alter the course of history. In Alexander's case, it shattered a fragile unity, setting loose wars that raged for generations. The silence of one man's body echoed into the cries of thousands on distant battlefields. And it reminds us that history often pivots not on triumphs, but on moments of uncertainty, moments where knowledge falters and human frailty shows through. Why do we still search for his tomb, still peer beneath Alexandria's streets, still chase the glimmer of a crystal coffin? Not to sensationalize his suffering, but to understand it. To know whether the man who seemed to conquer death was instead betrayed by it in the cruelest of ways. To hold for a moment an answer in our hands and bring clarity to a mystery that has haunted us for 2,000 years. And yet perhaps it is the uncertainty itself that draws us. The thought that Alexander still lies beneath the earth, perfectly preserved, waiting for our gaze. The image of Roman officials standing before the glass lid, unsettled by a body that looked alive. The possibility that we too might one day look through that lid and see him not a god, not a myth, but a man vulnerable and mortal who carried the weight of the world and was finally undone by its silence. In the cadence of history, his last secret remains his own. Some mysteries are never meant to be solved, but in searching for them we learn not only about the past but about ourselves, our hunger for certainty, our fear of fragility, and our need to believe that even in death we might glimpse something eternal. The story of Alexander's final days leaves us not only with mystery, but with lesson sobering truths about life, power, and human fragility. Though he conquered more territory than any general before him, in the end, his body proved no different from any other. The first lesson, then, is that mortality humbles all. No amount of glory, wealth, or victory can shield us from the limits of our own flesh. To remember this is to live with perspective, to hold ambition in balance with humility. The second lesson lies in the physician's struggle. They were the finest minds of their time, yet their knowledge was bounded by what they could see and touch. In their world, a faint breath could be overlooked, a weak pulse mistaken for none at all. Their verdict shaped history itself. The lesson here is that knowledge is never complete, and the consequences of acting on partial truth can be immense. We too live in an age of great knowledge, but we must remain aware of its limits, questioning our certainties and leaving room for humility and judgment. Third Alexander's generals remind us of the destructive urgency of power. Instead of pausing to care for their king, or to consider unity, they rushed to divide, to scheme to seize advantage. Their haste fractured the empire before the body was even laid to rest. The lesson is clear. Impatience and ambition, when left unchecked, can destroy what cooperation builds. Whether in kingdoms or in families, the rush to claim victory often leaves nothing but division in its wake. The fourth lesson comes from the embalmers and their art. Honey resins and sewn chambers were not merely ritual, they were a marriage of science and faith, an effort to cheat decay to give shape to eternity. Their work preserved not only flesh but also meaning for centuries. The insight here is that human beings strive to defy time, not only with monuments but with memory. What we create, how we are remembered, and the symbols we leave behind can outlast us. Our task then is to choose what legacy we wish to preserve. A fifth and haunting lesson comes from the possibility that Alexander remained aware in his silence. To imagine him listening as his empire unraveled, unable to intervene, is to confront the most terrifying vulnerability, powerlessness in the face of events that define us. Yet even here there is meaning. For if Alexander endured awareness without control, then he exemplifies the truth that control is never absolute, even for the mightiest among us. Life demands resilience not only in action, but also in surrender. Finally, the enduring search for his tomb tells us something about ourselves. The curiosity that drives archaeologists and dreamers alike reflects a universal human need to make sense of endings, to peer through the glass lid of time and know what really happened. Our fascination with Alexander's fate mirrors our own longing for certainty in the face of death. But perhaps the greater lesson is that uncertainty itself is part of the human condition, and learning to live with it may be as valuable as solving any mystery. From Babylon's fevered nights to Alexandria's vanished shrine, Alexander's story shows us that greatness lies not only in conquest but in how we reckon with fragility, how we seek truth, and how we choose to carry the memory of those who came before. In the end, history is not only about kings and empires, it is about us learning from their triumphs and their failures so that we might live more wisely. If you're fascinated by historical mysteries like the final journey of Alexander the Great, don't let the story end here. Make sure to leave a comment with your thoughts or perspective, and most importantly, click subscribe and turn on the notification bell